Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre, ambitious, and sometimes eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the goal wasn't to look healthy, but rather like someone who'd just been politely exercised. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. For you, it's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, looking pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep. It was a fashion statement, a social flex, a silent announcement to the world that said, I am too rich to ever see the sun. Thank you very much. Unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest yoga, smoothies, or a trip to the coast, medieval beauty flipped the script. Tan skin? That meant you worked outside, which meant you were poor, which meant gasp, manual labor, and nothing said not beautiful in the 14th century, like knowing how to milk a cow. So, the paler you were, the higher your perceived status. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft ivory glow. We're talking translucent porcelain with vascular undertones, skin so light it looked like you might have been recently startled by a ghost, or were a ghost. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate, especially if you were born with an actual working circulatory system. So, people helped it along. Noble women, and even men occasionally, would apply white lead powder to their faces. It provided that signature, corpse chic glow, and, as a bonus, slowly poisoned you. But beauty has always had its price. Some would use vinegar-soaked cloths to bleach their skin. Others applied a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites, which not only lightened the face, but also had the side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelet. Veins were sometimes painted onto the arms and chest using blue pigment to simulate delicacy, because nothing says noble like pretending your skin is about to split open. Even literature got in on it. Romantic poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and once, one as the moon in winter, which is a nice way of saying, she looks like she might faint. I love it. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty. It was shorthand for class, purity, and complete economic disengagement with agriculture. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning. Beauty, in the Middle Ages, often required commitment. And by commitment, we mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare on yourself. Because, for those striving to achieve that prestigious, pale complexion, nature just wasn't enough. So, they reached for makeup, specifically lead-based, white face powder. Yes, lead, as in the thing we now seal off old buildings for. But back then, it was considered cutting edge. The result? A smooth, pale, matte finish, the medieval equivalent of high-def foundation. It made the skin look flawless, and eventually, feel very not flawless. White lead powder was made by combining vinegar and metal, then allowing it to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a fine powder. Apply that daily, and voila, you looked like a luminous, delicate aristocrat with a secret death wish. And if your skin began to flake, blister, or fall off in small diplomatic chunks, even better, it meant the makeup was working. Probably, this wasn't a one-product routine either. Many added mercury-based rouge for color, or chalk dust for more staying power. Egg whites were brushed over the face for a smooth, glazed look. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, someone had rubbed it on their face in the name of elegance. The downside, other than the obvious, slow poisoning, lead-based products caused everything from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to hair loss and premature death, which is not listed on most modern skincare labels, but the fashion endured. Because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, nobility often chose the scenic route to the grave. Men weren't always immune either. Some male courtiers also used powders or skin treatments, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, where image mattered almost as much as lineage, or at least as much as smelling less terrible than your rival. Of all the medieval beauty trends, the obsession with high foreheads may be the most eyebrow-raising, literally, because people were removing their eyebrows. For it, a tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable. It was considered elegant, intelligent, and divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. The ideal forehead said, "I spend my days reading psalms and looking pensively out of castle windows," not, "I own a shovel." To achieve this noble look, women went to extreme and frankly, itchy measures. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, and sometimes even scalp hair was removed, inch by inch, to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a trim. This was a full-on forehead expansion project. Medieval grooming manuals advised women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from things like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in the name of showcasing a forehead that could double as a sundial. The results were striking. Portraits from the time show women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could host a joust on them. Combined with pale skin and soft facial features, this high dome aesthetic became shorthand for refined beauty. It wasn't all about the face either. Fashion supported this look too. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and hennons, those famous cone-shaped hats, all helped pull the hairline up, or at least hide the part where your eyebrows used to live. And this wasn't just some isolated castle trend. From England to France to Italy, noble women leaned into the high forehead style, while artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces began somewhere near the crown of the head. Of course, not everyone could afford the time or tools to pluck themselves into perfection. So, in a moment of medieval ingenuity, some women faked it by drawing their new forehead slightly higher and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's right. The Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated. They were actively eliminated. Modern trends may celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or erased them entirely. Why? Because A bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically seen as stubborn weeds. On the garden of the face, some went even further and shaved the brow area completely, ensuring that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster, high-def glory. It's the sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influencers blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back on. Back in the day, to remove the brows, medieval women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or, for the especially brave, mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or arsenic. Yes, arsenic, because nothing says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. This was more than just a passing fad. Art from the period, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, confirms the trend. Noble women are frequently depicted with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but skin. The result is either serene or slightly alien, depends on the lighting. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows persisted, especially as influences from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire filtered through trade and war. But, by and large, the message was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to court life, occasionally trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement, though full removal was rare among males, unless they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. What this all tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a bit angelic. Angels, after all, rarely have brows in art. Coincidence? Possibly. But it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation. The ideal was a subtle blush, like you just heard, a mildly scandalous poem, or stepped outdoors for 30 seconds, but not long enough to tan. Heaven forbid, a gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and general survival, all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing color on their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility, or doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area scholars are still trying to define. Still, women improvised. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even cochineal, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs, because beauty has never been kind. Some rubbed their cheeks to get that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment, dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both clergy and judgmental neighbors. For the wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were incredibly toxic. But the logic went something like, I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and socially respected. Rouge was typically applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Mirror access was limited. So many women relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. Of course, if your blush was too visible, you might be accused of imitating prostitutes, or worse, French courtiers. The horror, the goal, was always modest enhancement, not theatrical statement. And if someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind. Even nuns occasionally wore a touch of rouge, discreetly and supposedly only on feast days, because nothing says, "I serve the Lord," like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind the cloister in medieval Europe. If your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a bottle angel, you were already starting from behind. Blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and, in case you needed divine backup, the Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was, geographically speaking, almost certainly not. But realism was less important than radiance. If you were born blonde, congratulations, you were considered blessed and probably got out of a few chores. But natural blondness didn't last, especially in adulthood. So medieval women took matters into their own hands, and sometimes cauldrons, homemade hair lightening concoctions, included saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye, applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sunbasking. It worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes also included urine, which was thought to help lift color. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, it was deemed worth it. Beauty is, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. Hair texture mattered too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women. Once married, your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, nets, and head wraps, because apparently, the moment you said, "I do," your hair became a national security risk for noble women. Hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case. You needed to remind the room you didn't shear sheep for a living. Men weren't left out either. While not quite as judged, men with thick golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle were the medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off, unless you were trying to get married. Then suddenly, it became a strategic asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity and innocence, though not too loose, unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations, you now had a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments. From troubadours, the most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The effect? You looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich. And that was the goal. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear got more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into geometric shapes. Some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bells, because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. In many cultures, concealed hair was tied to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night, or worse, a French woman. Of course, some women rebelled. They would let a little curl slip out or wear translucent veils. That technically counted as covered, while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. The hennin, you know the one. Those towering, cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples. The hennin wasn't just headwear, it was a social ladder you wore. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner, often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade. Hennins were structured with wire frames, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil, usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Now, getting your hair to fit under one of these things was an art in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. Forehead real estate again, to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief, but hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escapons, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like wings. Great for drama, not so much for reign. Outside of nobility, most women stuck with veils, linen caps, or circlets. Simpler, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Still, hennins remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they had their own style statements. Think feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that could double as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who lived on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps 1 fig per week. beauty manuals didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and maybe swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was associated with nobility because, of course, if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the misfortune of muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Not quite corsets, those came later, but tightly bound kirtles and sears did the job just fine. Being too thin, however, wasn't the goal either. In times of famine or plague, being very thin was a red flag, as in, that person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered healthy and fertile. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic, you were in the sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for breath, and drinking wine to improve complexion. Protein, only if it had a feather still attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance, broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over. But even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power, the medieval version of sending a flirty emoji, only with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue, and maybe just a hint of melancholy." Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely said was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes of blue or gray were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired too, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal, soot, and optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around the lashes to make the eyes look bigger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look downward at all times, even if you trip over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were admired. It suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you just finished praying or reading something uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible, but wasn't about to brag. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath, specifically what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was at best an aspirational concept, and minty freshness wasn't invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically, you had. Medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs, not just for the taste, but to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of gum. It didn't sparkle your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, or at least less terrifying. In close conversation, for those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing as we know it wasn't standard. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small fibrous twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with, while your suitor recited bad poetry, and while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems like surviving winter or avoiding being burned. As a heretic, for noble women, the trick was to minimize offense. While maintaining grace, conversations took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited, and when in doubt, fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points: if you carried a small pomander, a scented orb filled with herbs, to wave gently in your own direction, as needed. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by age 30. So the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant, thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and mead, and lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism, with pliers. Despite this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare and seen as a mark of youth and fortune and perhaps a miracle. But people weren't going around flashing big toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, A demure, closed-lip smile was far more fashionable. Think, I might be contemplating a sonnet, rather than, I'm thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they too were quietly aware of the risks of showing molars. Men weren't immune either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line, his pearly whites gleamed like ivory. There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath, and bite alignment, when it came to medieval beauty standards. For men, the expectations were oddly specific. You didn't need to be chiseled, like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The sweet spot was somewhere between ready to joust and could write a poem about jousting without actually doing it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and very importantly, nobly unbothered. Not overly muscular. That suggested labor, but not soft either. That suggested laziness, or too much mead. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if. The squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think, prince in an illuminated manuscript, rather than village strongman. A well-groomed beard, or a smooth, clean-shaven face, was acceptable, depending on the region and era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was typically shoulder length and styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were in fashion in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally or looked like they did. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. Small heated rods or herbal rinses to enhance texture and shine, because nothing says, I'm above manual labor, like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles your fringe. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics helped create the ideal body shape, with extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often, with a hint of disdain. And if a man did happen to be naturally muscular, that was fine, as long as he wasn't caught. Actually working with those muscles, fighting in wars, was acceptable. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look was effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble, and that alone made you appealing. A kind of medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, scent management became an art form and not the glamorous, walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5 kind of art. More the mask it and pray variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we'd hope, especially depending on the century, the location, and the plague frequency. So to keep from offending nostrils, human and divine, medieval men and women turned to the alchemical power of herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's begin with the pomander, a small hollow ball made of metal, worn on a chain. or pinned to clothing, and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something more exotic, ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance, they were portable, smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a Febreze grenade. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters or vinegar infusions that smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution? Layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the woolen or silk outer garments. Some added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor. With fragrant optimism, bathhouses were a thing, especially during the early and late medieval periods. But access varied wildly. The church eventually frowned upon communal nudity, which really put a damper on hygiene enthusiasm. So many turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. Wiping yourself with a cloth, then spritzing on scented water and pretending that counted. And then there were the overachievers, people who kept flower petals in their shoes or stuffed herbs in their bed linens just to smell vaguely like someone who had recently seen a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a divine blessing, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself. Sometimes, all three. Before breakfast, to be beautiful was to walk a very fine line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, pale complexion, was considered a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least, unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as evidence of a pure soul. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember, and showing too much interest in one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all, French tendencies. Medieval sermons warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which, of course, was entirely the woman's fault. Eve set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you burned at the stake. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient or just unfortunate. The idea that outward appearance reflected inner character wasn't just popular, it was doctrine. In some circles, beauty meant grace, ugliness meant punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually quiet disappearance. So in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. And then, in a world far away from corsets and rouge, the Persian immortals emerged. They were more than just elite troops. They were a statement, a living symbol of imperial strength, precision, and unyielding continuity, born under Cyrus the Great. In the 6th century BCE, these warriors were not common soldiers. They were legacy incarnate, a force that never seemed to fade. If one fell, another rose, instantly, silently. So the number always remained the same, 10,000, always, as if they were eternal. To be an immortal was to be noble, disciplined, and loyal beyond question. They wore silken robes, scale armor beneath, and marched like shadows stitched in gold. Their appearance, their silence, their symmetry, it was all psychological warfare. No flash, no roar, just a cold certainty that what approached could not be stopped. They didn't blink, they didn't retreat, they endured. And that is what made them terrifying. They moved as one, a sea of elegance and death, a curtain of fate, sweeping silently across kingdoms. Their strength wasn't just in weapons, it was in uniformity, in patience, in the calm that comes before a storm, and in the quiet after victory. Now, as your eyes grow heavy with sleep, just one last thing before you drift off. If you enjoyed this little journey, then with a peaceful heart